What if one of the most powerful militaries in history won a war in just a few weeks, but still lost control of what came next? What if the greatest danger was not the enemy everyone could see, but the assumptions made before the first shot was fired? In March 2003, American and coalition forces crossed into Iraq with a clear objective: remove Saddam Hussein, eliminate a dangerous threat, and help create a more stable Middle East. The plan seemed straightforward. Intelligence reports suggested Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. Policymakers believed Iraqis would welcome foreign troops as liberators. Officials expected government institutions to survive the fall of the regime and a democratic government to emerge quickly. Many believed the campaign would become a model for transforming the region. Instead, Iraq became one of the most controversial conflicts of the modern era. The war itself lasted weeks. The consequences lasted decades. This is the story of the assumptions behind the Iraq War, the realities that followed, and how decisions made before the invasion reshaped Iraq, the Middle East, and global politics. Welcome to History Ledger. Today, we examine the assumptions behind the 2003 Iraq invasion, how those assumptions shaped critical decisions, and why the reality that followed changed the course of history. Let's begin. The threat that drove the war. The road to Baghdad did not begin in Iraq. It began nearly 2 years earlier in New York and Washington. On September 11, 2001, the United States experienced the deadliest terrorist attack in its history. Nearly 3,000 people were killed when hijacked airliners struck the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The attacks transformed American foreign policy almost overnight. Security threats that once seemed distant suddenly felt immediate. Government officials feared that terrorist groups might one day acquire chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons. In this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, attention increasingly turned toward Iraq. Saddam Hussein was not an unknown figure. For decades, he had ruled Iraq through a powerful security apparatus and a reputation for brutality. During the 1980s, his regime had used chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq War and against Kurdish civilians inside Iraq. Those actions were well documented and remembered by intelligence agencies around the world. After the Gulf War of 1991, Iraq was required to dismantle its weapons programs under international supervision. United Nations inspectors spent years investigating Iraqi facilities, destroying prohibited weapons, and monitoring compliance. But uncertainty remained. Some officials believed Saddam was hiding capabilities from inspectors. Others argued that sanctions and inspections had already severely weakened Iraq's military potential. Within the administration of President George W. Bush, concern grew that Iraq might still possess weapons of mass destruction. Intelligence reports suggested the possibility of hidden chemical and biological stockpiles. There were also claims that Iraq was attempting to revive elements of a nuclear program. As evidence was gathered, interpreted, and debated, confidence among senior policymakers increased. Public speeches reflected that certainty. Administration officials warned that waiting for absolute proof could be dangerous. The fear was not simply what Iraq possessed. It was what Iraq might eventually become. Throughout 2002, the debate intensified. Supporters of military action argued that Saddam Hussein represented an unacceptable risk in a post-9/11 world. Critics questioned whether the evidence justified war. Several allies expressed concern about the reliability of intelligence reports. At the United Nations, inspectors returned to Iraq to conduct new investigations. Their teams searched factories, military facilities, laboratories, and suspected weapons sites. Months passed. Evidence remained inconclusive. Inspectors requested additional time. But political momentum was moving in a different direction. In February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell presented intelligence findings before the United Nations Security Council. Satellite images, intercepted communications, and intelligence assessments were used to argue that Iraq possessed prohibited weapons programs. For many observers, the presentation appeared convincing. For others, questions remained unanswered. By March 2003, the decision had effectively been made. Coalition forces assembled in the Persian Gulf. Aircraft carriers moved into position. Armored divisions prepared for deployment. The argument was clear. Iraq possessed dangerous weapons. Iraq represented a growing threat. Action could not wait. On March 20, 2003, the invasion began. Cruise missiles struck targets in Baghdad. Coalition troops crossed the border. The war that would reshape the Middle East had officially started. And the assumption at the center of it all was simple. The weapons existed. The world would soon discover whether that assumption was correct. Victory in weeks, problems for years. When the invasion began, coalition planners expected a difficult campaign. Iraq possessed one of the largest militaries in the Middle East. Its army had fought a long war against Iran and had confronted coalition forces during the Gulf War of 1991. Many expected fierce resistance around major cities and prolonged battles across the country. Instead, events unfolded with surprising speed. American and coalition forces advanced north from Kuwait with remarkable momentum. Precision airstrikes targeted command centers, communication networks, and military infrastructure. Columns of armored vehicles pushed deep into Iraqi territory. The strategy known as shock and awe aimed to overwhelm the regime psychologically as well as militarily. Within days, Iraqi defensive positions began collapsing. Many units surrendered. Others simply disappeared. Some commanders abandoned their posts altogether. The military that had once appeared formidable proved far weaker than many had anticipated. As coalition forces approached Baghdad, the world watched dramatic images broadcast across television screens. Statues of Saddam Hussein were pulled down. Government buildings were abandoned. Senior officials vanished from public view. The regime that had ruled Iraq for decades was falling apart before the eyes of the world. On April 9, 2003, coalition troops entered Baghdad. For many observers, it appeared the war had effectively been won. The conventional military campaign had lasted only weeks. Compared to many previous wars, casualties among coalition forces were relatively low. From a military perspective, the operation seemed to confirm the confidence of planners in Washington. The dictator was gone. The capital had fallen. The government had collapsed. Now came the next phase. And that was where assumptions began colliding with reality. Before the invasion, many officials believed Iraqis would broadly welcome coalition forces. Some certainly did. Years of repression, fear, and political violence had created genuine hostility towards Saddam Hussein's regime. In some areas, residents celebrated the regime's collapse. Yet Iraq was not a single community with a single viewpoint. It was a country shaped by ethnic, religious, tribal, and political divisions. Experiences differed from city to city and region to region. As days passed, the initial scenes of celebration were increasingly overshadowed by something else. The sudden disappearance of state authority. Government ministries stopped functioning. Police largely vanished from the streets. Administrative systems that had managed daily life simply ceased operating. Across Baghdad and other cities, widespread looting erupted. Government offices were stripped. Museums were raided. Infrastructure was damaged. Warehouses were emptied. Hospitals struggled to maintain order. Television viewers around the world watched scenes that raised troubling questions. If the war was over, why was chaos spreading? For many Iraqis, the immediate concern was no longer Saddam Hussein. It was security. The expectation that state institutions would continue functioning after the regime's collapse proved overly optimistic. Years of authoritarian rule had concentrated power around the regime itself. When that regime fell, many institutions weakened or collapsed alongside it. Coalition commanders suddenly found themselves responsible not only for military victory, but also for governing an entire country. Yet preparations for that task had been limited. Much of the planning before the invasion focused on removing Saddam Hussein. Far less attention had been devoted to what would happen afterward. As weeks turned into months, frustration grew. Basic services remained unreliable. Electricity shortages continued. Unemployment increased. Many Iraqis who had hoped for immediate improvements instead faced uncertainty about the future. At the same time, armed groups began emerging across the country. Some were motivated by ideology, others by nationalism, some by religion, others simply by anger at foreign occupation. Small attacks against coalition forces became more frequent. Roadside bombs appeared. Ambushes increased. What had initially looked like isolated incidents began forming a pattern. The assumption that major combat operations would quickly give way to stability was beginning to unravel. Military victory had been achieved. But victory and stability were not the same thing. The fall of Baghdad had ended one chapter of Iraq's history. What came next would prove far more difficult than anyone had imagined. And soon, a pair of decisions would transform a growing problem into a national crisis. The decisions that changed everything. By the spring of 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime had fallen. The Iraqi military had been defeated. Baghdad was under coalition control. From the outside, it appeared that the hardest part was over. But history would remember what happened next far more than the invasion itself. The challenge facing coalition leaders was enormous. They were now responsible for governing a country of more than 20 million people. Every major decision would shape Iraq's future. Some decisions would shape it for decades. To oversee the transition, the United States established the Coalition Provisional Authority, often called the CPA. Its mission was to administer Iraq until a new government could be formed. Officials hoped to remove the influence of Saddam Hussein's regime and build the foundations of a democratic state. On paper, the goal seemed reasonable. In practice, the decisions that followed produced consequences few had anticipated. The first major decision was known as de-Ba'athification. Under Saddam Hussein, membership in the Ba'ath Party had been a requirement for many government jobs. Teachers, administrators, engineers, military officers, and civil servants often joined not because they were loyal supporters of the regime, but because it was necessary to advance their careers. The CPA decided that senior members of the Ba'ath Party would be removed from government positions. The intention was to prevent former regime loyalists from maintaining power. But the policy quickly expanded beyond a small group of senior officials. Thousands of experienced professionals suddenly found themselves excluded from public life. Schools lost administrators. Government ministries lost managers. Technical expertise disappeared almost overnight. Many Iraqis who had expected to help rebuild the country now found themselves unemployed and politically marginalized. Then came a second decision, one that remains among the most debated choices of the entire war. In May 2003, the CPA formally dissolved the Iraqi military. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and officers were dismissed. Many had not fought against coalition forces. Many were simply waiting for instructions from whatever government came next. Instead, they received no salaries, no positions, and no clear future. In a matter of days, Iraq lost one of the few national institutions that still possessed organizational structure. The consequences were immediate. Thousands of trained, armed, and frustrated former soldiers returned home without work. Many felt humiliated. Others felt betrayed. Some concluded they had no stake in the new Iraq that coalition authorities were trying to create. Insurgent groups quickly recognized an opportunity. Former military personnel brought valuable experience. They understood weapons, logistics, communications, and tactics. Many insurgent organizations soon included former officers from Saddam's military. Attacks against coalition forces increased dramatically. Roadside bombs became more sophisticated. Ambushes became more deadly. Cities that had initially appeared relatively calm became centers of resistance. Meanwhile, sectarian tensions that had long been suppressed under Saddam Hussein began surfacing. Political competition increasingly followed religious and ethnic lines. Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish communities often viewed the future through very different lenses. Distrust grew. Violence spread. What had begun as an insurgency gradually evolved into a broader struggle over Iraq's identity and political future. Coalition forces found themselves fighting a conflict they had not expected. The original invasion plan focused on defeating Saddam Hussein's government. It had not fully anticipated a prolonged insurgency, sectarian conflict, and state collapse occurring simultaneously. As casualties mounted, optimism faded. American commanders requested additional troops. Political leaders searched for solutions. Yet many of the challenges they faced were linked to assumptions made before the invasion and decisions made immediately afterward. The expectation had been that Iraqi institutions would survive the fall of the regime. Instead, key institutions had been dismantled. The expectation had been that democracy would emerge quickly. Instead, instability spread. The expectation had been that the end of the war would bring peace. Instead, a new and far more complicated conflict was taking shape. And while violence consumed Iraq, another reality was emerging. The central justification for the invasion itself was beginning to face growing scrutiny. Because the longer investigators searched, the more troubling the question became. Where were the weapons that had started the war? Assumptions meet reality. As violence spread across Iraq, another battle was unfolding far from the front lines. It was a battle over evidence. The central argument that had helped justify the invasion was now under intense scrutiny. Before the war, American and British leaders had repeatedly warned that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, potential nuclear ambitions. These claims had been presented as urgent threats that could not be ignored. Now Iraq was occupied. Military forces controlled the country. Investigators had access to facilities that had previously been closed. If the weapons existed, this was the moment they would be found. Search teams traveled across Iraq. Suspected weapons sites were inspected. Factories were examined. Documents were collected. Scientists and former officials were questioned. Weeks became months. Months became more than a year. But the discoveries many expected never came. No active stockpiles of chemical weapons were found. No active biological weapons stockpiles were discovered. No reconstituted nuclear weapons program emerged. The assumption that had stood at the center of the invasion was collapsing. In 2004, the Iraq Survey Group released its findings. Its investigation concluded that Saddam Hussein had ended large-scale WMD programs years earlier. While some ambitions and limited capabilities may have remained, the stockpiles that had been presented as an immediate threat simply did not exist. The revelation sent shockwaves through governments, intelligence agencies, and the public. Questions quickly followed. How had so many intelligence assessments been wrong? How had policymakers become so certain? Investigations later found a combination of factors. Some intelligence sources proved unreliable. Important uncertainties were often downplayed. Contradictory information received less attention. In an atmosphere shaped by fear after September 11th, worst-case scenarios frequently received the greatest weight. But the weapons issue was not the only assumption facing collapse. Another major claim had linked Saddam Hussein's regime to international terrorism. Following the trauma of 9/11, many Americans believed Iraq might have played some role in the attacks or maintained an operational partnership with al-Qaeda. Yet as investigations continued, evidence failed to support those fears. The findings of the September 11th Attacks Commission concluded that there was no credible evidence of a collaborative operational relationship between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. The connection that many had assumed existed was not supported by the available facts. At the same time, the broader strategic vision for the region was also being tested. Supporters of the invasion had argued that removing Saddam Hussein could transform the Middle East. A democratic Iraq might inspire reform elsewhere. Authoritarian governments could face pressure to change. A more stable region might emerge. Instead, events moved in a very different direction. Sectarian conflict intensified. Extremist organizations exploited instability. Neighboring countries became increasingly involved in Iraqi affairs. And perhaps most importantly, Iran's influence expanded significantly. For decades, Saddam Hussein's Iraq had served as a major regional counterweight to Iran. After his removal, that balance shifted. Political parties with close ties to Tehran gained influence. Iranian-backed groups expanded their presence. One of the war's most unexpected consequences was strengthening the position of a country that American policymakers had long viewed as a strategic rival. The assumptions behind the invasion had promised one future. Reality produced another. Yet the story of Iraq is not simply a story of mistakes. It is also a story about the limits of certainty, about how intelligence can be imperfect, how predictions can fail, and how decisions made by leaders can affect millions of lives long after headlines disappear. Today, more than 2 decades later, historians, military officers, intelligence analysts, and policymakers continue to study the Iraq War. Not because they all agree on its lessons, but because its consequences were so profound. The invasion removed a dictator, but it also unleashed forces that few fully understood. The war demonstrated that winning battles is not the same as winning peace. That removing a government is easier than building one. And that assumptions, no matter how confident they seem, must always be tested against reality. Because in 2003, some of the world's most powerful leaders believed they knew what would happen next. History had other plans. If this story changed the way you think about the Iraq War, then you're only seeing part of the picture. History is filled with moments where governments, generals, and intelligence agencies made decisions based on assumptions that later proved disastrously wrong. And some of those stories changed the course of the world even more dramatically. Subscribe to History Ledger, because the next story begins with another decision that seemed certain at the time, until history proved otherwise. UTRO. History is often shaped by battles, elections, and powerful leaders. But sometimes it is shaped by something far less visible. An assumption, a prediction, a belief about what will happen next. The Iraq War reminds us that decisions made with confidence can still produce unexpected outcomes. It shows how complex societies can be, how difficult it is to predict the future, and how the consequences of major decisions can echo for generations. More than 20 years later, historians, military leaders, and policymakers still study this conflict, searching for lessons that might help avoid similar mistakes in the future. And that is why history matters. Not because it tells us what happened, but because it helps us understand why it happened and what we can learn from it. Thank you for watching History Ledger. If you found this documentary informative, please consider leaving a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe to History Ledger and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. Because in our next story, we'll explore another moment when leaders believed they understood the future, only to discover that history had a very different outcome waiting for them. Until next time, thank you for watching.